I guess you best get the music school or we are going to be all over you. That's your goal, right? Yeah. Good, thank you. Yeah, it's a good theme. It's a wonderful world. Oh, I know sometimes it seems like it isn't such a great world, but I'm here to tell you that's not the truth. There's signs of the beauty and the wonder of it all around. Maybe some of you saw the movie about Jackie Robinson. Something that was never reported in the newspapers. It was in the movie, but not in the newspapers at the time that it happened. Jackie was up there. He'd been in the league for a couple months. Was catching it from every stadium he was at because he was the first African American in baseball and was just catching it all over. So one game in May 13th, 1947, Cincinnati, Ohio, Pee Wee Reese, all-star shortstop from Kentucky, well-known racist, walks over to Jackie Robinson, who's playing first base, puts his arm around him, and just stands there. That's all he did. Then he walked back, started playing shortstop again. Never made the newspapers, ever. Not even entirely sure that it happened, except through some eyewitnesses, including newspaper reporters who were afraid to put it in the newspaper. Go figure. Then again, in 1948, August 14th, they were playing the Boston Red Sox, the Brooklyn Dodgers were, and Robinson had moved to take second base, to play second base in place of Eddie Stanky, who was an all-star ball player who had been traded by the Dodgers. And so Pee Wee went over again that day, 1948, put his arm on his shoulder, just stood there, shut the crap down. That one didn't make the newspapers either. It did in biographies and autobiographies later on, but not at that moment. But you have those little moments and those little times and occasions when you have something that we Christians would understand as a covenant. A covenant that a person of faith makes with God to love the earth and the people in it. And to, when it's called upon, when you're called upon to make a statement that God loves the world, and you believe that, and you're going to do what you can to bring healing and reconciliation and wholeness to a world which is desperately in need of it. Now, we live in a country, of course, where there is freedom of worship. We don't have any problem, have any issues about where to go to a worship center. We can just do that any old time we want to. No fuss, no muss. Where we have issues, of course, is in the public sphere, right? You're not quite sure all the time how it is that you're going to try to practice your faith and proclaim, as the 70 went out and talked about Jesus and did some healing and those kinds of things, and then came back and reported to Jesus. Well, we're in that same boat in terms of our public lives, Monday through Saturday. How best to say God loves the world? And let people know that. Not so easy to do, and it means sometimes and on occasion taking some chances that you're going to, if not get villainized, at least get a reputation as a goody two-shoes or a religious nut or, you know, something like that. Or just being weird or self-serving. You know how people are. They'll come up with a reason, often a negative one, as to why you're doing a good thing. But that's why Jesus did some very basic training with the disciples before he sent them out and let them know, hey, listen, you're going to get out there, you're going to want to express the love which God has for the whole world, and you're going to do it in these particular locations, and people are going to diss you. They're going to misunderstand on purpose, or they're just going to badmouth you because it's politically incorrect, because they'll be coming from that lens. Or economically incorrect, they'll come from that lens, or psychologically incorrect because they'll be coming from a different lens there still again. And it's what Jesus did was to simply prepare people for loving the world into existence as best they were able to do, and be willing to take some hits and have the strength of faith to do that. I was reading a little article by Pamela Finkenshire. She's a pastor at a Lutheran church out in Minnesota, and she goes mountain biking. Any of you mountain bike? Yeah, Alan, you do. Yeah, you ever fall? Yeah, I'm all scratched up and scraped up. But of course, yes, that goes with it. Yeah, she was saying that falling down is just part of the sport. She was asked in a local newspaper interview, and she said, yep, it is. Well, it's the same with serving God. There was Abba Macedonius from the 4th century, a desert father. Don't ask me why I was reading him. I always read the desert fathers. They're pretty smart because they spent a lot of time alone, had a lot of time to think about stuff. And one of the things that he said was that part of our faith as people who have made a covenant with God to love the world is that we then are in a position of trusting that God will help us to be strong enough to make promises and keep them. Now, I know you know the old saw here in our culture, don't make promises you can't keep. A lot of people are more cynical than that, say don't make any promises because it's just going to lead you into all kinds of pain in the next situation, so don't make promises. All right, in the faith, when you think about covenant, you are making a promise daily to love the world into existence, to love it into health by healing people who are not healthy, and doing that as best you know how. So you're living a promise every day of your life. What Abba Macedonius, the desert father of the 4th century, noticed was that we make promises because that we trust that God, when we fail in our promise making and promise keeping, will pick us up, forgive us, and send us on our way to making more promises. And he said this, it is the property, okay, notice, intrinsic to us people. That's human beings. It is the property of men and women to fall and to rise again as often as this may happen. You notice he's very open-ended about it, the rising and the falling and the making and the breaking and the keeping of promises, happening all the time. But the point that he makes further, of course, and this is where Paul was starting to talk to the congregation in Galatia too, was that promise-making based on a covenant that we have with God in the world in which we live is unconditionally made by us. And because we make an unconditional promise to love the world into existence, as God has made an unconditional promise to you and me to love us in all circumstances and to pick us up, we can make our promises and keep them because God is great enough to make our faithfulness happen. And so we become more skilled as servants, as disciples, in the making and the keeping of the promises based on the covenant. Now, how do you stay connected to the world? St. Augustine of Hippo, that would distinguish you for you. St. Augustine of Carthage, again from the 4th century. Yes, big names. He said that all creatures are to be used for the sake of enjoying God. And you see, his understanding of Paul's letter to the congregation in Galatia was the following. If everything in the world is created by God, including every one of you is created by God, good. That means that by relating to each other, we are able to see the presence of God. Now, I know that's a little theoretical because there are some people who are so incredibly irritating and aggravating and otherwise you just want to kill them.
Amen.
Oh, not literally, Jeanette. Just, you know what I'm saying. Figuratively, metaphorically. Good Lord. Thanks for the help. That where all things are meant and placed in our locations for the sake of enjoying God, we then, with our covenants, of loving the world into existence are also saying that everything God has made and everyone in it is good. And because every good thing is meant also to point us to the ultimate truth, that God loves the world and is present in it. So when you relate to people, one of the things that Macedonius and Paul and St. Augustine of Hippo were talking about was every person that you ever will meet or ever will relate to is a living symbol of the presence of God in the world. And that you have to sometimes pierce through them to see the reality on the other side. It's like when you look at the cross. You know, you can see this as a beautiful piece of art made by somebody, and it's really nice. But when you also then look at it, you're also thinking as a Christian about the death and resurrection of Jesus and how he died for us. That's piercing through the cross and seeing through to another meaning. And that is how these guys in the early centuries, and Paul especially, to the congregation in Galatia, talked about how as Christians we can covenant with the world by piercing through the veil and seeing the presence and the love of God in it. So that people are not ends in themselves, but are ends and means to seeing the love which God has for the world. Now we live in a different culture, and you know that as well as I do, right? We live in the culture today of very much individualistic ways of thinking, acting, and behaving.